You didn't just watch a routine royal update. You watched a system reach its breaking point. A king and his heir standing side by side, voices shaking, finally admitting that the rules which have governed this monarchy for 1,000 years are no longer enough to save it. 5 minutes ago, headlines were rewritten, and a tragic truth was confirmed. King Charles has officially decided to rewrite the royal line. This wasn't about tradition. This was about survival, secrecy, and the moment a father decided to choose his family over the cold, unyielding machinery of the palace. Jar. For centuries, the British monarchy has operated like a flawless stage play, where every smile is rehearsed and every silence is strategic. But tonight, the stage lights have flickered out, and for the first time, we are seeing the cracks in the foundation. I've watched this pattern in every fragile institution that is more afraid of the truth than of a scandal. They didn't just manage the optics this time. They tried to control reality itself, and they failed. The words released by the palace were brief, carefully chosen, and almost painfully restrained. Yet, every sentence carried a weight that sent shockwaves across the globe. There were no reassurances, no comforting phrases that usually soften the blow of royal news. Instead, the language hinted at a severity and a permanence that cannot be undone. You don't lose sight of a future king and his heir for months by accident. You don't cancel a schedule that has been set in stone for years unless the gears inside the castle have finally ground to a halt. What happened behind those closed doors at Clarence House wasn't just a meeting. It was a constitutional reckoning. Imagine a king, a man who has lived his entire life by protocol, suddenly realizing that the very rules he was born to protect are the ones suffocating the people he loves most. Silence in a family is one thing, but silence in a public institution is a weapon, and tonight, that weapon has turned inward. The palace wanted you to believe that everything was under control, that the privacy they demanded was for healing. But privacy in the world of the royals is often just a shield, used to manage information and delay the inevitable arrival of a painful truth. Tonight, that shield has shattered. This wasn't transparency. It was the truth being dragged out at the last possible moment, because the leaks had become a flood, and the whispers had become a roar. The youngest members of the royal line are no longer just symbols on a balcony. They have become the center of a storm that threatens to redefine what it means to be a royal in the 21st century. If a king has to overrule his entire court just to tell the truth, we aren't just looking at a medical crisis. We are looking at a system that is struggling to remain human in a world that demands absolute perfection. Stay with me, because what I'm about to reveal next isn't just about a change in a list of names. It's about the night the king decided that the crown could no longer afford to be a fairy tale. It's about the secret documents, the suppressed medical truths, and the one person who changed the rules of the game forever. To understand why King Charles was forced to take such a drastic step tonight, we have to look back at the months of suffocating silence that led us to this precipice. It started with a whisper, a planned and successful surgery that the palace insisted was routine. But as the days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, the reassurance felt more like a facade. You don't lose sight of a princess for months by accident. You don't keep canceling a future king's schedule for nothing. The atmosphere behind the palace gates wasn't one of quiet recovery. It was one of panic management masquerading as privacy. While the public was fed polished lines, the gears of the monarchy were grinding against reality. We saw William, the man born to be the face of stoicism, begin to pull away. He canceled engagements at the last minute, missed events that were non-negotiable, and the reassurance photos we were promised never materialized, or worse, they were questioned by the world's media. Silence in a family is one thing. Silence in a public institution is another. This wasn't just about protecting a sick family member. It was about an institution that had become more afraid of a vulnerable truth than of a global scandal. I've watched this pattern before. When an ancient institution depends so heavily on the image of perfection, any sign of human frailty becomes a test case for its survival. The palace tried to control the narrative, but in doing so, they created a curiosity loop that they couldn't close. Every cancelled appearance and every vague statement only served to heighten the collective dread. Behind the scenes, the conflict was reaching a fever pitch. It was a war between the palace machine, which prioritizes the stability of optics, and a husband and father who was watching the emotional center of his world nearly slip away. The rumors of internal fights and medical leaks began to paint a picture of unexpected complications that no official announcement dared to mention. The institution was trying to treat a mortal crisis as background noise. But you cannot fix an old house with cracked walls by just hanging beautiful pictures over the fissures. You must look at the damage itself. Tonight, the king finally looked, and what he saw terrified him more than any bad headline ever could. The true history of a dynasty is rarely written in the speeches you hear. It is written in the silences they can't maintain, and the meetings they never wanted you to know about. Tonight, we go inside the walls of Clarence House, to a room heavy with the scent of old wood and the crushing weight of 1,000 years of expectation. This was the moment the palace machine met its match. It wasn't a foreign enemy or a political revolution that threatened the crown. It was a father's heartbreak and a son's refusal to play a part in a lie any longer. Eyewitnesses near the estate that evening spoke of an atmosphere that felt brittle, as if the air itself was about to shatter. High-level advisors, men who have spent their lives protecting the image of the monarchy, were seen entering through side doors, their faces drained of color, and their movements stiff with an urgency that ignored all standard etiquette. This was not a consultation, it was a crisis. King Charles, a man often portrayed as a figure of traditional composure, was reportedly pacing the floor, caught between the rigid demands of the old guard and the raw, unyielding protection of Prince William. At the center of the table sat a single, one-page document. It wasn't a law, and it wasn't yet an official proclamation, but its contents were explosive. It was a proposed adjustment to the line of succession, cited under constitutional preparedness. In plain language, the institution was preparing to bypass the human element of the family in favor of the survival of the crown. The advisors were pushing for a containment strategy, more silence, more vague health bulletins, and a quiet removal of certain heirs from the immediate public responsibility. They saw the vulnerability of the family as a liability that the public could not handle, while the king himself was still stabilizing his own reign. But William, according to those close to the situation, reached his breaking point. Imagine standing in a room where your child's future is being discussed as if it were a budget line or a PR disaster. William didn't just disagree. He challenged the very foundation of why they were all there. He reportedly told the council that if the crown requires the sacrifice of a child's dignity and a family's truth just to stay relevant, then the crown had already failed. This was the night the king had to choose. On one side was the advice of Camilla and the senior strategists who argued for stability at all costs. They feared that admitting the scale of the medical crisis would trigger a wave of Republican sentiment and constitutional questions they weren't ready to answer. On the other side was his heir, his son, whose eyes reflected the same pain the king himself had felt decades ago when his own life was subjected to the cold machinery of the palace. Charles looked at the document, the cold, ink-stained proof that the system preferred ghosts to humans, and he made a decision that will haunt the history books for centuries. He decided to tear up the script. Have you ever wondered what happens when a system built on absolute secrecy begins to collapse from within? The palace can control the photographers, they can edit the media messages, and they can stage the perfect portraits. But they can never truly control the conscience of those who have witnessed too many lies. Last night, the wall of silence that the British monarchy has spent months painstakingly constructing officially shattered. It wasn't through a polished press release or a royal broadcast, but through a devastating medical leak that stripped away every layer of the palace's deception. It started with a single, jarring headline splashed across the front page of the nation's most controversial tabloid. Prince Louis. The diagnosis confirmed. Below it sat a scanned image of a medical report stamped, official, and undeniable. This document was dated just weeks before the sudden collapse at Windsor, and it contained enough forensic detail to send a shockwave of grief and fury across the globe. The truth was not a routine procedure or private time for studies. The truth was a rare neurological disorder, chronic, degenerative, and currently without a cure. Suddenly, every reassurance and every clever denial fed to us by the palace crumbled like glass under a spotlight. The public didn't just react to the medical news, they reacted to the betrayal. For months, we were fed fragments of vague information and hollow promises of recovery. Now, the truth was forced into the light, not by the institution, but by a rogue insider, a whistleblower, who risked everything to force a level of transparency the Crown was too afraid to provide. This insider didn't do it for money, nor for revenge. The message published alongside the report was only a few words long, but it carried the weight of a moral reckoning. The public deserves the truth. Louis deserves to be seen, not hidden. Those words lit a fire under a conversation that the monarchy could no longer contain or manipulate. The reaction from the nation was a raw mixture of heartbreak and outrage. Some called the leak a disgrace, a shameful violation of a young child's privacy. Others called it a necessary justice, a reckoning for an institution too accustomed to hiding human suffering behind the cold machinery of protocol. Prince Louis's name trended worldwide within minutes. People began sharing childhood photos of the spirited boy waving from the balcony, realizing that while we were laughing at his cheekiness, a dark reality was unfolding behind the scenes that no child should have to face alone. Why was the truth buried so deeply? Why did it take a leak to force the palace to be honest? These are the questions haunting every newsroom and every dinner table in Britain tonight. In the subsequent silence from the palace, a silence devoid of any denial or explanation, the trust between the public and the Crown has officially reached its breaking point. Commentators are already calling this the greatest communications failure since the death of Princess Diana. But beneath the scandal lies a more painful reality. A family is now grappling with the fact that their youngest son's future is being dissected by the world, while they scramble to save the remaining pieces of a fractured crown. The leak had paralyzed the palace, but it had ignited a fire in the heart of a mother who was tired of hiding behind a crown. For days, the world had been shouting, demanding answers, and dissecting a child's medical report as if it were a political manifesto. But then, the static broke. 5 minutes ago, the palace didn't release another dry, third-person statement. Instead, they announced a live broadcast. No royal backdrop, no stiff military medals, and no rehearsed script from the press office. Just a woman, a chair, and a truth that was about to break the nation's heart. When Catherine, the Princess of Wales, appeared on the screen, she didn't look like a future queen. She looked like a mother who hadn't slept in weeks. Her eyes were rimmed with the kind of exhaustion that no makeup can hide, and her voice, usually so poised and melodic, carried a tremor that told you the stiff upper lip protocol had finally been discarded. This wasn't a royal appearance. It was an act of raw, human desperation. As a mother, she began, and in those 3 words, she dismantled centuries of royal distance. She didn't speak of titles or succession. She spoke of the agonizing reality of watching her youngest child, Louis, fight a battle that no amount of privilege could win. She confirmed the diagnosis that the leak had exposed, but she gave it a human face. She described the good days where Louis still laughed and painted, and the unbearable days where the neurological decline made even standing a victory. She addressed the secrecy directly, looking straight into the lens with an aching honesty. She explained that the silence wasn't a cover-up to protect the institution, but a desperate attempt to protect a childhood. I wanted him to have one more summer where he was just a little boy, not a patient, she whispered, her voice cracking for the first time. She spoke of the guilt she felt, not for hiding the truth, but for letting the world's curiosity turn her son's private struggle into a global scandal. The most powerful moment came when she described the nights spent by his bedside. She confessed that while the world was speculating about her disappearance, she was actually learning how to read stories to a child who was losing his ability to follow the words. She thanked the public not for their curiosity, but for the love they had shown her son. But she also issued a plea for space, for compassion, and for the right to walk this dark road as a family. not as a spectacle. When the screen finally faded to black, the outrage that had been building against the palace didn't vanish, it transformed. It turned into a collective, national grief. Catherine had done what the palace machine never could. She had turned a constitutional crisis into a human story. She had traded the protection of the crown for the power of the truth, and in doing so, she reminded everyone that beneath the tiaras and the titles, there is a family bleeding in the dark. While the world was weeping over Catherine's courage, a far more dangerous storm was brewing behind the soundproofed doors of the palace. You saw a family united in grief, but the reality was a crown fracturing in real time. This wasn't just a disagreement over a press release, it was a full-blown generational war. On one side stood King Charles and the old guard, clinging to the ancient mantra of "never complain, never explain." On the other stood Prince William, a man who had watched the machinery of the palace destroy his mother, and he was damned if he was going to let it destroy his wife and son. Inside the palace, Catherine's emotional broadcast was seen by the traditionalists not as a victory, but as a catastrophic breach of protocol. To the strategists who have managed the monarchy for decades, vulnerability is a liability. They believe that the moment a royal shows a tear, the mystique of the crown, the very thing that keeps it above the people, begins to evaporate. Charles, still trying to stabilize his young reign, reportedly viewed the video with a mixture of fatherly concern and professional terror. He feared that by showing the human side of the struggle, they had invited the world too far into the inner sanctum, making the institution look fragile, or worse, out of control. But for William, the palace machine had become the enemy. Imagine the tension. A future king who refuses to return to public duties, who cancels briefings, and who ignores the frantic recommendations of PR advisors. To William, this wasn't about optics or the survival of the monarchy. It was about the survival of his soul. He had spent years molding himself into the perfect heir. But the moment his son's health was treated as a PR problem to be managed, rather than a tragedy to be mourned, he drew a line in the sand that no king could cross. According to deep insiders, the confrontation between father and son at Clarence House was the loudest and most bitter clash since the days of the abdication. Charles allegedly questioned William's emotional fitness to rule if he couldn't separate his personal pain from his sovereign duty. That comment hit like a dagger. It was the ultimate insult to a man who had sacrificed his entire private life for the crown. William's response was chillingly clear. If this crown cannot stand for compassion, then it stands for nothing. This standoff has created a vacuum at the heart of the British state. With the king focused on containment and the heir focused on protection, the institution is drifting. Camilla, strategically aligned with Charles, argued that sympathy is not a strategy, that while Catherine's moment was powerful, it was unsustainable. She pressed for a return to business as usual. But William has made it clear, there is no business as usual when his family is bleeding. The mask of unity has slipped. We are no longer looking at a seamless transition of power. We are looking at a family divided by the very crown they are destined to wear. And as the internal defenses of the palace continue to crack, the public is beginning to realize that the greatest threat to the monarchy isn't the whispers from the outside, but the silence and the coldness from within. You are not just witnessing a media crisis, you are witnessing a revolution of the heart. As the news of Prince Louis's condition swept across the continents like a wildfire, the world did not respond with cheap curiosity or toxic conspiracies. Instead, it responded with a level of solidarity never before seen in the history of the modern monarchy. This was the moment the information gap was filled not with speculation, but with a powerful, collective light that began to melt even the coldest walls of the palace. This was the night truth defeated protocol, and humanity rose above the crown. It started in London. As dusk fell over the city, thousands gathered silently outside the gates of Kensington Palace. There were no camera flashes, no shouting reporters, and none of the usual chaos. Only thousands of flickering candles, creating a sea of light that seemed to steady the nation's nerves. Handwritten notes from children, taped to the iron bars with shaky letters, and hundreds of white roses piled at the base of the walls. But this wasn't just a British moment. Within hours, Those images had traveled the globe, igniting a digital tide of empathy. From Toronto to Sydney, Cape Town to New York, people gathered in city squares not to protest or demand political change, but to stand with a child they had never met and a family many had once criticized. Social media, often a place of division, transformed into a global cathedral of support. The hashtag number, Love for Louis, became a banner for millions, reaching a scale that the palace's PR office could never have manufactured. It proved one thing that the old guard never understood: humanity always outweighs curiosity. This global response hit the palace's internal defenses like a battering ram. For decades, the advisors had operated under the fear that vulnerability would lead to the collapse of the institution. They thought that if the public saw the royals as weak or suffering, the mystique would be gone. But they were wrong. They watched in shock as the world embraced the Princess of Wales for her honesty and rallied around Prince William for his protection of his son. The very thing the advisors tried to hide, the raw, bleeding heart of a family, was the very thing that saved the monarchy's relevance in the 21st century. Parents of children with similar invisible battles began sharing their own stories, creating a massive web of connection. They wrote to William and Catherine, thanking them for showing that even those behind the highest walls are not immune to pain. The palace machine was forced to realize a hard truth. Real power doesn't lie in stone walls or rigid etiquette. It lies in the ability to connect with the human soul. Prince Louis was no longer just the cheeky boy waving from the balcony. He had become a symbol of resilience. He had done what generations of royals before him had failed to do. He had turned a distant, cold institution into a part of the human family. But just as hope seemed to rise from the ashes of the scandal, a final, unforeseen twist arrived. A small, folded piece of paper, written in a child's shaky hand, was about to be revealed, and it would deliver a message that would shatter the hearts of the nation and the crown alike. Just when the world believed the emotional peak had been reached with Catherine's confession, a final, quiet thunderbolt arrived. It didn't come through a high-definition broadcast or a legal memo from the king's solicitors. It came on a piece of cream-colored stationery, marked with the shaky, earnest handwriting of a child who was only beginning to understand that his world was changing. 5 minutes ago, a handwritten note from Prince Louis surfaced, and it has done what no politician or PR expert could do. It has shattered the remaining defenses of the British monarchy and replaced them with a raw, undeniable humanity. At first, when the image of the letter began to circulate, people questioned its authenticity. It felt too intimate, too fragile to be real. But as the palace remained pointedly silent, neither confirming nor denying its existence, the truth became clear. This was Louis's voice, unedited by advisors, unpolished by the palace machine. It was a message addressed not to a parliament or a court, but to everyone who loves me. The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of 1,000 years of suppressed royal history. "Sometimes I don't know why my legs feel tired," he wrote. "Sometimes I want to run, but I just sit and watch the sky instead." There was no bitterness in those lines, no resentment for the titles he might lose or the duties he might never fulfill. There was only the quiet, profound processing of a child trying to make sense of a body that could no longer keep up with his spirit. For a public that had been fed months of clinical fragments and private medical reviews, these few sentences felt like a spiritual awakening. Louis didn't write about thrones or crowns. He wrote about his brother and sister, about how George sneaks him sweets when the doctors aren't looking, and how Charlotte reads him stories when the nights feel too long and the shadows in the palace feel too heavy. He wrote that while people call him brave, he is really just trying to smile like mommy does. That single line, the connection between the suffering child and the suffering mother, has become the emotional epicenter of this entire saga. But it was the final line of the letter that detonated across the global consciousness. He ended with a simple command that has now become a mantra for millions. "Don't be sad for me. I am still shining." He signed it simply, Lou, with a small, lopsided heart drawn underneath. This letter has become a mirror that the monarchy can no longer avoid. It has forced a fundamental question. If a child has the courage to speak his truth with such grace and honesty, Why has the institution spent centuries hiding behind the cold, gray walls of secrecy? Why is the palace machine so afraid of the very thing that makes people love them? Lewis didn't just write a note, he delivered a masterclass in leadership, a leadership of the heart that values connection over protocol and truth over image. The letter hasn't just broken hearts, it has ignited a demand for a new era of transparency. It has made the political maneuvering of King Charles and the rigid traditions of the old guard look small and outdated. As this child's handwriting echoes through the halls of power, the crown is learning a painful lesson. You can control the narrative, you can control the succession, but you can never control the light of a spirit that refuses to be dimmed. The letter from Prince Louis didn't just break hearts. It acted as a final, decisive hammer blow to the very foundation of the British monarchy. You have to understand that in the world of the palace, words are weapons, and silence is a shield. But when a child's shaky handwriting bypasses the censors and the strategists, it creates a shift in power that no crown can prevent. We are no longer just talking about a sick little boy or a family in grief. We are talking about a constitutional earthquake the moment the King of Hearts officially overthrew the King of England. Inside the corridors of Westminster and the hidden offices of the Privy Council, the fallout from this week's revelations has been catastrophic. The old guard, the advisors who have spent decades ensuring that the institution remains cold, distant, and seemingly immortal, are now standing in the wreckage of their own strategy. Their insistence on secrecy, their obsession with containment, and their fear of vulnerability have all backfired. By trying to hide Louis's condition, they didn't protect the crown. They made it look deceptive, out of touch, and fundamentally cruel. The secret memo that Charles had drafted weeks ago, the one outlining a temporary adjustment to the line of succession, is now a toxic liability. In a world that has seen Catherine's tears and read Louis's innocent hope, the idea of removing an heir based on a neurological diagnosis feels less like a constitutional necessity and more like an act of cold-blooded betrayal. The public demand for reform is no longer a whisper, it is a roar. People are calling for a Royal Health Transparency Council, a body that would ensure no future royal child is ever hidden away like a shameful secret or a broken machine. But the most significant shift in power is happening between the king and his heir. Prince William has emerged from this crisis not just as a future sovereign, but as a father-king. By choosing his son over the palace protocol, by standing beside Catherine as she shattered the stiff upper lip tradition, William has reset the monarchy's moral compass. He has shown that the only way for the crown to survive in the 21st century is through authenticity, not image. The internal war we discussed earlier has reached its endgame. King Charles, once the architect of a slimmed-down monarchy, is now facing the reality that his institution is being slimmed down in a way he never intended by the loss of public trust. The palace machine is running on empty, its gears clogged by the very secrets it tried to protect. Meanwhile, William and Catherine have become the true emotional center of the state. They have proven that the people no longer pledge their loyalty to a piece of jewelry or an ancient stone throne. They pledge it to the human beings who have the courage to bleed in public. As the legal experts and constitutional lawyers scramble to figure out how to manage a line of succession that now includes a symbol of resilience rather than a symbol of perfect health, one thing is clear: the rules have changed forever. The night King Charles decided to rewrite the royal line was supposed to be about legalities. Instead, it became the night the people decided that the monarchy would only be allowed to exist if it learned to have a heart. The clock has stopped ticking on the old era of secrecy, and the dust is finally settling on a landscape that no royal historian could have predicted. We began this journey with a palace in crisis, a king in conflict, and a child hidden behind the heavy velvet curtains of tradition. But as we reach the conclusion of this extraordinary saga, it is clear that the night King Charles decided to rewrite the royal line was not the end of the monarchy. It was its rebirth. The crown has survived for 1,000 years by adapting. But tonight, it didn't just adapt. It underwent a profound human metamorphosis. Prince Louis, the boy who was supposed to be a liability to the line of succession, has instead become its most powerful asset. He is no longer defined by a neurological diagnosis or a secret medical report. In the eyes of the world, he has become the Prince of Hearts, a title once held by his grandmother, Diana, but carried now with a new kind of fragile brilliance. By allowing his voice to be heard through that shaky, handwritten note, Louis did something no constitutional lawyer could ever achieve. He broke the cycle of coldness. He proved that the greatest strength of a modern monarchy is not its perceived perfection, but its shared humanity. The legacy of this moment will be felt for generations. We are seeing the emergence of a new dawn, where William and Catherine are the primary architects of authenticity. They have successfully reset the expectations of the public. The stiff upper lip has been replaced by the steady heart. The palace has been forced to accept that transparency is not a threat to security, but the only true form of security in a digital age. The Royal Health Transparency Council, once a radical suggestion from the public, is now being whispered about in the halls of Parliament as a necessary evolution. The Crown is learning to breathe again. King Charles, in his final acceptance of this shift, has secured his place in history as a transitional figure who had the courage to let go of the past. He chose to listen to his son. He chose to honor his daughter-in-law's truth, and he chose to protect his grandson's dignity over the rigid demands of the old guard. In doing so, he saved the institution from its own obsolescence. The line of succession has indeed been rewritten, but not in the way the lawyers intended. It has been rewritten with the ink of compassion and the blood of a family that refused to be broken by their own weight. As we look toward the future, the images of the global vigil and the millions of candles lit for Louis remain burned into the collective memory. They serve as a reminder that even in a world of power plays and political maneuvering, love remains the ultimate currency. Prince Louis is still shining, just as he promised. And as long as the crown continues to reflect that light, the light of honesty, resilience, and truth, it will continue to endure. The masks have fallen. The secrets are out. And for the first time in a century, the British monarchy doesn't just look like a museum of the past. It looks like a living, breathing part of the future. The tragedy was real, but the transformation is even more significant. Don't be sad for me. I am still shining. Those words will echo through the halls of Windsor and Kensington for years to come. They are the new motto of a new era. A monarchy that can bleed is a monarchy that can lead.